trickling in, so we can just go ahead and get started. Welcome and thank you all for joining us today for this virtual discussion about keeping renters housed in the face of the unprecedented job losses that we're seeing today. For those of you who I haven't met, I'm Juan, Sebastian, Arias with the Metropolitan Planning Council, and we're grateful to be hosting today's conversation with our partners at Enterprise Community Partners. For those who aren't familiar with MPC, we're an independent nonprofit policy change organization. We've been around for about 85 years, and we're dedicated to shaping a more equitable, sustainable, and prosperous greater Chicago region. So today's discussion is the first of what we expect to be an ongoing series about shaping an equitable response and an equitable recovery to the health and economic crisis that we're all in. Today specifically, our goal is to have a conversation about renter stability, both to go over what we know is currently in place, what actions have been taken so far, but also to go over what else needs to be done. So while we get started and while I begin to go over the agenda, I want to welcome everyone to use the chat box to start introducing yourself, share where you're joining us from, where in the city, where in the region, what sector or what organization you represent. We do have all attendees muted, so I see that question came in too. Feel free to use the chat box throughout the whole discussion. We are also going to be monitoring the Q&A feature, so that's another way that that would actually be the better way that you can submit any questions. In terms of a flow, I'm here doing the welcome right now. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Miriam from Enterprise in just a few minutes. She's going to do a little bit of framing before we start with the discussion itself. She'll introduce our panelists. We have 4 of them. You can see their videos on the screen right now if you're tuned in there. And we're gonna, for the discussion itself, we're gonna start off with just about 5, maybe a little bit more than 5 minutes with each panelist to just give some opening remarks, and then we're gonna go into a moderated discussion after that. We have a number of you submitted some questions beforehand, so we've incorporated or tried to incorporate some of the questions that have already been shared. We'll do our best to incorporate Q&A questions as they come up, and we've also reserved the tail end slot of this discussion, so from about 12 to 12:15 for the Q&A portion, which Miriam is going to help facilitate too. So that's what we're hoping to do for the next hour and 15 minutes. And excited you're all here. I can see a number of you already introducing yourselves in the chat. That's great. I think with that, I'm going to pass it over to Miriam to get us going.
Great. Thank you, Juan Sebastian. I'm assuming, can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me? Okay, great. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. As Juan Sebastian mentioned, I'm with Enterprise Community Partners. For those of you that aren't familiar with us, we're a national organization, nonprofit that provides policy, capital, and programmatic solutions to the affordable housing and community development sectors. So I'm here to just provide a very brief framing to get our panelists started. As all of you are probably well aware, we are experiencing and anticipating really unprecedented levels of housing insecurity due to the pandemic. Really a lot of it related to the unemployment crisis, but as many of you know, we were already in a housing crisis long before this pandemic started. To give you just a little bit of sense of scale, we did a back of the envelope estimate that there are upwards of 140,000 renters who probably won't be able to pay rent in the coming months. Under that are some subbullets of the assumptions that I used in coming up with that back of the envelope estimate, but really looking at low-wage renter households, and then that 30–40% of low-wage workers are employed in these highly impacted industries of hospitality, retail, arts, entertainment, and recreation. At first, when we did that, it seemed kind of like an outrageous number, but actually, when you compare it to what the city received in their new emergency rental assistance program, where they were able to offer emergency rental assistance to 2,000 tenants and received 83,000 applicants in the first month alone of this pandemic. Actually, we're probably assuming that this 140,000 is really a conservative estimate. And as we know, we were in a housing crisis already, that for most of these households, rent already eats up, large part, 75% of these low-wage households, rent eats up well over a third of their income. So losing a paycheck really can, be the difference between shelter and homelessness. And we obviously have known for a long time the relationship between housing and health. But right now we really are under a microscope showing those deep relationships where the risk of homelessness and overcrowding when you move in with family and friends really has very significant health implications. And, as we all know as well, that, that this does not fall equally along social and racial lines due to our longstanding inequities and injustices in our economic, healthcare, and housing systems, and many others. We know that this falls differentially and greatly impacts Black and Brown communities and low-income communities in our city. Many of you, I'm sure, saw some of the data and maps that came out from the city last week that showed that the maps of the incidence rate of COVID-19 really tracks along all of the race and class maps for the city. And when they released the data on the reported cases as well as the deaths due to COVID-19 by race, you can see that the Black community is 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with COVID-19 and 5 times more likely to die due to COVID-19 when compared to non-Hispanic white populations in the city. It's also been pretty amazing to see how quickly we've seen a lot of really unprecedented actions, both at the local, state, and federal levels. We've seen eviction moratorium, stimulus bills, emergency rental assistance programs, and many, many other responses trying to mitigate this crisis. But as many of you probably, and what we saw, thank you all for so many questions that came in. There are many more questions than answers, and I think that we are really excited to have this panel with us today, our panelists with us today, to help us try to untease some of this, the fire hose of information that's coming out so that we can really understand what are some of the solutions coming out, what do we see along the horizon, what are some of the unanswered questions. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce our panel today. This is the order that they're going to be speaking to us in. As Juan Sebastian mentioned, they're going to be having about a little over 5 minutes to give some opening remarks, and then we're going to pass it over to really have an in-depth discussion about some of these issues. So first, we're going to hear from Daniel Hertz, who's the Policy Director of the Department of Housing in the City of Chicago. Mark Swartz, who's the Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing. Jawanza Malone is the Executive Director of the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization. And Stacey Young, the Director of the Preservation Compact. So we are very excited to have them. I'm going to stop sharing my screen with that. And I am going to pass it over to Daniel and ask him to give his opening remarks.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Enterprise and Metro Planning Council for putting this on and for inviting the department and me to be here. I'm glad to have the opportunity. So, in the 5 minutes, I'm just going to sort of give a quick overview of how the city and the department really see the problem that we're facing and some of the sort of paths forward we see to addressing it. So, as Miriam talked about, I think the biggest immediate threat in terms of housing is just the fact that an enormous percentage of people have lost income over the last several weeks. Nationally, 17 million people have filed for unemployment. That number seems to be constrained, frankly, by the sheer technical ability of state unemployment systems to even process the claims, and we only expect that number to increase in the coming weeks. And as people are not getting their income, obviously for almost everybody, their largest single expense is housing. And so, their ability to sort of meet that expense is going to be, they're not going to be able to. They're not going to be able to pay rent, not going to be able to make mortgage payments. We've already seen, just to add to some of the statistics that Miriam went over, the National Multifamily Housing Council indicated that the proportion of people who were not able to pay rent in the first 5 days of April went up by about 13 percentage points in April to 2020 compared to 2019. Percentage of, I just saw today, percentage of people who are unable to make their mortgage payments on their homes went up only by about a percentage point in this month, which I think is partly reflective of people who own being in a somewhat more, on average, secure financial position. But also we very, very much expect that those numbers will dramatically increase in May, just because people may be able to cover the first month, or they were working for all most of March but not in April, and so we expect the next month to be those numbers to get much, much worse. Now, as Miriam pointed out, there have been a number of sort of immediate steps taken to protect people who are not able to pay at the moment. So there are actually 3 overlapping eviction and foreclosure moratoriums in the city. One at the county, one at the state, and then one at the federal level passed through the CARES Act late last month. But there's a couple issues with that. One is that those 3 orders all have slightly different rules, or in some cases very different rules, and cover different properties. And so one immediate task for the department that we're working on is just trying to have a way to inform tenants, or have tenants inform themselves, what actually are their rights right now. What can they expect in terms of protections from eviction if they're not able to pay? Because that that can be significantly different depending on whether they, for example, live in a building that has a federally backed loan or not. But another big question is what happens when these eviction moratoriums end, right? At the moment, there is no forgiveness in any of these orders. And as far as we understand, as soon as these eviction orders are over, people could be evicted for non-payment of rent that they were not able to make during the moratorium period. So how to address that? One of the ways, obviously, is we created the emergency rental assistance program. As Miriam said, we were able to come up with money for 2,000 grants, received 83,000 applications. We're working on a second round, but we know that that's not going to be, nothing that the city's resources are not going to be sufficient given the massive scale of the problem. So we're certainly joining voices with other people nationally, advocacy groups, other local and state governments, asking for a massive amount of direct rental assistance to be part of the next federal relief bill. We are also really conscious that if renters are unable to pay their rent, that has not only devastating effects for those households, those families, but knock-on effects throughout the rest of their communities and the rest of sort of the housing world. Landlords, especially smaller community-based landlords, depend on that rent to make their own expenses. Institutions like community development financial institutions also are vulnerable to sort of large-scale rent non-payment. So we're looking at ways that we can be helpful to those institutions as well. And then, of course, as Miriam pointed out, we know that the effect of the sickness itself, the illness itself, COVID-19, is very much disproportionately being felt, especially in Black communities in Chicago. And, we have strong evidence that the economic impact is also very much disproportionately felt by lower income, predominantly Black and Latino areas, with people who are, coming into this situation with the most economic precarity, and who are at the highest risk of being laid off. furloughed or losing income. And so we anticipate that this is not just going to be a sort of individual household level or business level problem. This is going to be a community level problem that's going to compound as neighbors are all sort of feeling the same thing. And so we also are very much conscious that we need to have a sort of community-based response to this. And with that, I'm already going over my 5 minutes, so I'll leave it there, and I know there will be time to discuss later on. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. Now we'll pass it over to Mark.
Mute. Hi, can everyone hear me? Let's see. Can people hear me? Hello? Oh, good. Excellent. I'm the Executive Director at Lawyers Committee for Better Housing. We serve low and moderate income renters living in the private rental market, so everybody but public housing. We defend renters in eviction courts and offer pre-litigation services to help renters avoid eviction court. We also have a supportive services department that screens renters in eviction court who may qualify for up to $5,000 in homeless prevention funds. So I want to give you a little bit of background about eviction court, where we fear, as Daniel mentioned, that many individuals whose jobs are impacted by COVID-19 may end up. But what I want to say about keeping renters housed, I think, is equally relevant before the pandemic as it is now. I just think that the COVID-19 pandemic has heightened the need for reform. So just to tell you a little bit about eviction court where I work, the racial disparity is obvious to anyone who visits the court. 72% of tenants are African American, 62% are women, and almost half are African American women. A lot of the injustice occurring in eviction court, though, is due to disparities in rates of representation. Almost 80% of landlords have attorneys and only 10% of tenants do. Eviction court also just deals with the very narrow question of who has a right to possession, who has a right to have the property. And it's all about the notices, not the underlying circumstances. These legal restrictions on what people can bring to court and the lack of the tenant representation make eviction seem really simple to the actors working in eviction court every day. So I want to let you know, what the underlying law is, so I can give you some of our recommendations. Briefly, in eviction, in Illinois, evictions can be filed for cause because the tenant did something like not paying the rent, or eviction can be filed not for cause because the landlord just doesn't want to renew the tenant. Renters we see in eviction court typically fall into one of those two categories, either non-payment of rent or a mass eviction because the building's being vacated. For non-payment of rent issues, it's not at all surprising, that people are in court for non-payment of rent given how cost burdened people are and how little meaningful savings people have. Nationally, half of renter households spend more than 30% of their income on rent, and 25% spend more than half of their income. And at LCBH, we see people that are spending almost all of their income on rent. And frankly, I don't know how they are doing that, but but they are, and borrowing from family or whatnot. And as many of you may know, just because a renter qualifies for rental assistance or to live in public housing doesn't mean the subsidies are available to them. Currently in our country, only a quarter of renters who qualify for rental subsidies receive those rental subsidies. So the second category of renter being evicted are just people being asked to leave because the landlord doesn't want to renew the lease. Often it's a business decision. The property can be more profitable if it's rehabbed or reconfigured if it's a single room occupancy property. So pre-COVID-19, there are around 20,000 evictions filed every year. And the lion's share of these are, again, these two matters that tenants have very little control over. They can't pay the rent, or they're being terminated without cause just because the landlord wants to terminate them. Now, I should just add as a side note that oftentimes conditions problems are always in the mix. Renters also have very little control over the conditions of the property, and non-payment is often prompted by conditions problems. And non-renewal is often prompted by a tenant complaining about the property being in disrepair and being evicted because they're complaining. So if, as I've described it, the eviction court is not at all interested in underlying causes, such as an unexpected medical cost, or in this case, pandemic, it's only concerned with the rights of possession. It's like a hospital where sick people go, where the treatment makes them sicker. And so eviction court individualizes the problems and externalizes the underlying issue of housing stability. And it does it in a way that's extremely inefficient. Eviction court is actually a missed opportunity to assist vulnerable people who are in the throes of housing instability and connect them to resources to stabilize them. What the COVID-19 pandemic may have done is make it easier to reorient the system from one that adjudicates individual failings and externalizes these social issues to one in which we actually look at how to connect tenants who are facing housing instability to resources to keep them in their homes. So how do we do that? Locally, housing advocates have created momentum for several solutions to stabilize rental housing generally. And these have been ongoing, way before the crisis occurred. There's proactive rental inspection so that we can keep the property in good rental condition, in good condition to rent. Just cause protection for renters, rent stabilization, and right to counsel. And COVID-19 may have made some of these solutions seem less fanciful, but all of these solutions are have been in the mix since before this pandemic, and I think they're going to be in the mix after this all resolves, because this is the way that we can keep housing stability. So very quickly, because I only have about a minute left, proactive rental inspections means that it's no longer a complaint-driven system. It's where renters are put in harm's way when they complain about conditions problems. Property owners would have to certify that their property was met minimum standards of health and safety and code compliance. Just cause protections would protect renters who have done nothing wrong from being asked to leave their unit. Renters who are asked to leave would receive compensation so that they wouldn't bear the burden of being forcibly displaced. This is what we did during the mortgage foreclosure crisis when the city passed the Keep Chicago Renting Ordinance to protect renters living in foreclosed property from needless displacement. Just cause protects all renters from being evicted for no reason. And this was in fact on the mayor's platform, housing platform that she announced, what seems eons ago before the pandemic. I'm going to skip Lift the Ban because I know Jawanza will cover it ably. And then I end with eviction diversion. We need to connect renters with short-term assistance with rental assistance funds to help a short-term crisis. And then we need, for long-term crises, we need to get renters connected to rental subsidies. It doesn't make sense to be bringing people that are facing housing instability in eviction court and putting them on the street. Finally, we need right to counsel, because this is the way that we can protect, that we can ensure that these rights are actually being enforced. And all of these rights, if they come into being, will make right to counsel a lot more easy to initiate, because there are going to be fewer and fewer people brought into eviction court. So the takeaway is eviction court, I believe, needs to be re-envisioned as a place where renters can obtain assistance and resources, and where eviction orders are a remedy of last resort.
Thank you, Mark. Jawanza, pass it over to you.
So thank you. Miriam, Daniel, Mark, I think have done a really good job laying out the problem. I would say we have a unique opportunity here to either help a lot of people or fail a lot of people. One statistic that I did not hear, we heard yesterday in the governor's daily briefing, 513,000 unemployment claims filed since March 1st. That's a ton of people. Numbers higher than 2018 and 2019. Early part of the year. I mean, obviously this is a problem that we did not foresee. But as you heard, many of the things that we need now are things that frankly, us in the advocate community have been calling for a really long time. And so in terms of immediate need, crisis response, Governor Pritzker simply needs to repeal the Rent Control Preemption Act. He has the power, the authority, and the need to do it right now. We need to make sure that there's also cancellation of rent. People can't pay it. I mean, we heard the numbers, right? Roughly 69% tenants nationwide pay their rent on time, which is down from 85% roughly the month prior. And all expectation is that that number is going to be even lower for May. What happens if the stay-at-home orders continue? What if people continue to die? What can we expect for June? And so there's a reality that we all have to address. Understanding the city is limited in what it can do. The county is limited in what it can do. The state and federal government, frankly, are limited in what they all can do, right? So it calls on all of us to be able to figure out what ways we can show up and participate. I would also say in terms of immediate response, we also need to lease the vacant units that exist within the Chicago Housing Authority. There's roughly 2,000 vacant units that are still left. When we participated in the lease-up campaign a number of years ago, there was something around 4,000 just vacant units that were just sitting, that the Housing Authority was not leasing. Obviously, people could be in those places, and over the course of a few years, they were able to lease half those. We need to get that 2,000 number down even further. Long term, let's look past this immediate moment. We need to begin prioritizing low income and working families for affordable housing. Right now, affordable housing is laughable at best. You have a ton of arguments that are made for why affordable housing should exist. You have responses from the city and the state in terms of them diverting resources to ensure we have affordable housing. But the question is, affordable for who? I mean, if you are scheduling affordable housing for people who make $80,000 a year, and you eliminate opportunities for people who make under $20,000 a year, there's not affordable housing being made available. And so just saying that we aren't able to attract investors if we limit affordable housing to very low income families, just frankly is not good enough. Where are poor people expected to live? Especially when the Housing Authority has multi-year waiting lists, when there is way more demand than there is supply. I would also say we need to make sure that we pass rent control. Regulating rent is something that has to happen in this market. The profit incentive that exists for corporate landlords and private equity firms limits the ability, again, for poor people to find adequate housing. One place that's affordable one year oftentimes is not affordable the very next year. And so the only way to really address this is to begin regulating how much rent can go up 1 year at a time. I would also say, just last two things, we need to make sure that affordable housing is attached to every and all development deals that take place in this city and in this state. I know that's very controversial, but again, when we look at the demand, 180,000 units are needed right now in the city of Chicago. That number balloons 20 times statewide. 3.6 million units of affordable housing is needed. We're not going to build our way out of this problem. Nobody's building that number of units. And frankly, I doubt that there's political will to build that number of units. Something has to fundamentally shift in how we choose to house people. Lastly, I would say we need to look at an approach to development that is neighborhood by neighborhood specific. There are low cost housing options, there are moderate cost housing options, and there are higher cost options for people in Chicago, across the state, across the country. How do we prioritize what each of these markets need in a way that's effective to make sure that, again, people are able to be housed who need to be housed at a rate that's affordable? Thank you.
Thank you, Jawanza. Last but not least, Stacey.
Great, thanks. I'm Stacey Young, and I'm going to talk about what's happening with landlords. But wait, before you get up to start making lunch, because you think you don't need to hear from this guy. Not sure if you can see that. Okay, sorry. Hear me out. I'm going to talk about landlords as small business. I head up a policy collaborative called the Preservation Compact. We bring together lots of different stakeholders together to strategize about preserving affordable rental housing, from government and nonprofits to for-profit developers and community groups. The compact is housed at CIC, Community Investment Corporation, which is a nonprofit lender. And for the past 35 years, we've financed rental owners to buy apartment buildings, mostly unsubsidized buildings, and we're financing mostly for-profit, small to mid-sized building owners. And again, these rental owners are traditional small businesses. So think about janitors who saved their money to buy that 6 flat down the street. These are entrepreneurs, just like the small local businesses that we revere and hold up in other contexts. It's just that these guys own housing. They don't sell cupcakes or fix up bikes. And these small businesses are struggling to weather this storm, just like those cupcake owners and bike shops. Except, of course, there's much more at stake because these owners house our most vulnerable households, and that's why we're all here today. And these building owners have exactly the same goals as Daniel, Mark, and Jawanza, and all the community groups fighting on the front lines who are on this call. We all have the same goals in mind. Landlords succeed when tenants succeed, and buildings succeed when tenants succeed. I think we'll get into this later, but the last recession taught us what happens when buildings destabilize because owners stop investing. We all saw in 2009 how quickly the cycle of decline and deterioration happened. And again, we're talking about small to mid-sized owners who know their buildings and neighborhoods. We aren't talking about big, nameless, faceless companies with deep pockets. Many of these owners have thin margins and a fragile infrastructure. And if the landlords are vulnerable, the buildings are vulnerable. If the landlords and buildings fail, the other small building owners are still struggling. They're not going to have the money to buy those failed buildings. It's the nameless, faceless companies from out of town that have the money. And we learned in the last recession that they're the ones who will buy the buildings. So the Preservation Compact and CIC have really focused since the crisis began to understand what resources are available. What do we know? What don't we know? And what are the best ways to access those resources? And what should we all be advocating for together? Mark and Daniel and Jawanza have all talked about rental assistance, and that's one way that we can all really get together. Another thing is thinking through what is available. The expanded unemployment benefits sound great. And it sounds like, you know, there's going to be a lot of resources available and some folks are going to be able to benefit from that. We've got some great information on the Preservation Compact webpage from the Department of Employment Security, but it's still very unclear to many of us about exactly who is eligible, who's not, and when they're going to get those resources. Yesterday, it was reported that gig workers and independent contractors, some of the workers who are now eligible for unemployment under the expansion, are having trouble in Illinois getting their assistance set up, and it's likely that the payments won't reach them until May 11th, which is a long way away. And so this is a great example of how landlords and community groups have a common goal. We need this shared understanding of what these resources really are and what they mean and what they don't mean for some folks. If possible, we should be communicating what we do know and understand and communicate in a common language. We need to use and share the best information. The worst thing that can happen is that tenants get different and confusing information from different sources. It's all very confusing. And for tenants who can barely struggle to bump along right now, the last thing they need to do is try to figure out who's saying what about the same thing. Another example, when news articles talk about lenders giving building owners forbearance on their loans. So a building owner who gets this benefit of forbearance is not forgiveness. These owners have to repay those missed payments. It just means they don't have to make payments, but they do have to pay them back later. And they have to pay them back on a very short timeline. And we all know that catching up is easier said than done. in a lot of different contexts, especially when things are tight. So another common point, I know MTO and other community groups are telling tenants who are concerned that they can't pay rent, they're telling tenants to talk to their landlords. And I couldn't agree more. Now is not the time to avoid landlords. Now is not the time to sort of worry instead of talking to your landlord about concerns that you have. I keep saying this, sharing information and communicating with each other is more important now than ever. The more the landlords know, the better they can help tenants, and then they can ask what they need from their lenders. They won't get it. I mean, I think there's a lot of issues with what landlords are able to get or not get. But if they can plan because they have the information, everyone's going to be better off. So now's the time to communicate with each other more, not less. We know that rents help the owners pay their mortgages and their taxes and utilities and the upkeep of the building and bigger improvements. And for tenants who can't pay rent, and many still can't, we know that, we need to come together to advocate for real resources. We need rental assistance and a lot of it. Some national groups are calling for 40 billion. I'm actually on the same page as the folks who are calling for 100 billion. I know homelessness groups are advocating for local jurisdictions to deploy new federal CDBG and ESG dollars to help pay for housing. We know that we need all these resources as much as we can get to keep tenants stable, to keep buildings stable. We all agree we need healthy people, healthy tenants, and healthy neighborhoods. And right now we need to come together. Now is not the time to huddle apart on different sides. We have the same goals, so let's work together to figure out how we can achieve those goals. And let's make sure we're all working together and communicating to make that happen.
Great, thank you, Stacey. I'm now going to pass it over to Juan Sebastian to get the discussion started.
Thanks, Miriam, and thanks, Daniel, Mark, Jawanza, and Stacey. This is just as a quick reminder for folks. I see a couple of you have raised your hand through the app. Given the number of participants that we have, we're going to try to filter as many questions as we can through the Q&A feature. So please submit any questions through there. We'll try to catch the ones in the chat box, but it's a little bit harder. And then just as a reminder, we have like maybe 20 minutes now for the discussion, and then we'll do some more of the direct Q&As. Now, that said, that's not that much time, and there are clearly lots of topics that were just raised that deserve a more discussion. But we'll try to do what we can. And the first theme that I wanted to pick up on is related to racial disparities. And this is something that I think came up in almost all of our comments about existing disparities that existed prior to this pandemic, disparities in the economic impact of the pandemic, disparities in the health impact of the pandemic, and even thinking about some of the unemployment insurance benefits or some of the cash stimulus bills. There's also disparities in who's receiving support, for example, right? As we know that a lot of undocumented residents, taxpaying residents are not included in federal stimulus. So given this layer of the many existing disparities, the first question I want to pose to the panel, and maybe Daniel, we can get started with you, is just given what we know about racial disparities, how can that inform a housing response?
Sure. So I can talk about this maybe a little bit through the lens of the COVID housing assistance grant that we put together, the sort of $1,000 grant, 2,000 grants in the first round. You know, we put that together before any of this data about the disparities came out. But as you said, and as other panelists mentioned, you know, given everything we know about Chicago and the US, you know, we were able to pretty confidently predict that there would be major racial disparities in impact across the city. And so one of the things that we did to try to address that was work through community groups, especially in the areas that we expected to be most impacted, to try to use their networks to find vulnerable people who we would not necessarily get just through one big online application process. So, what we ended up doing was taking, of those 2,000 grants, 1,000 we distributed through a central online application. The other 1,000 grants we distributed through these community-based organizations that work on the ground, predominantly on the south and west side. And indeed, when we saw the applications just through our own online portal, we did see even on those applications were heavily skewed towards those south and west side Black and brown communities. As we're now thinking about a second round of this, we obviously have a lot more data to work with. We have a lot more policy context to work with as well. And I think what Stacey was talking about what are the other resources that have been made available since then, including especially the unemployment, expanded unemployment under the CARES Act, has really made us think about, well, who is still not covered, right? What are still the gaps in that? And I think obviously people who are undocumented are a major gap. We're still sort of figuring out what the vulnerabilities around, gig workers and cash workers, people who are not traditionally covered by unemployment insurance are, and we know that those are very, racially not evenly distributed around the city. In sort of immediate term, I think we're thinking very much about how to target the next round of grants to those communities. Going forward, and I'll wrap up here. Going forward, I think again, we are very much going to lean on and work with our community-based partners to help inform both, what's going on the ground, what are people seeing, what do they need, and to help us actually reach and help those people and sort of funnel resources where it's needed most.
Thanks, Daniel. And kind of picking up on that community-based organization or community-based response note, I think I'm sure everyone on this participating in this webinar is aware of the deeply entrenched segregation, both in Chicago and across the region. So there's obviously there's a geographic and community lens that is applied to this too. And so, Jawanza, turning to you, I'm curious as a representative also working more deeply in a specific neighborhood and community, how do you see this coming up there? What might a community-based response look like, or what does it mean for particular neighborhoods to be even more hard hit?
Yeah, I think what this moment really helps us to see in a way that takes it out of theoretical is just the intersectional nature of community development and the fragility of development in low income and working communities across the city, but then also across the state. You see businesses, for example, that are already challenged to maintain profitability, struggling to get the support that they need in this moment, right? Once the shelter in place and stay at home orders were declared, and people had to shut down their businesses if they weren't able to convert to carry out or delivery model. People who own these businesses have to pay rent or mortgage somewhere. And so there's that automatic ripple effect because they're losing money. They also have family members, they have friends. They themselves may recognize symptoms of a coronavirus infection. And so what happens at that point, right? When you have the trauma of watching yourself succumb to this illness, seeing someone you care about die simply from an illness, right? And how does that affect your ability to do everything else you already have to do, right? That 70% number, 70% of the people who died from a coronavirus infection are Black. That means that you're talking to people on the south and west sides of the city who likely know someone who has died from an illness, right? I think it's hard to miss the fact that this is a viral infection where people are getting symptoms. They're going to a doctor, they're going to somebody presenting these symptoms, and they're being sent home, waited out, right? They aren't able to get the care that they need. And so the fact that you have, that we have this system where structural racism is the norm means that healthcare impacts our ability to house ourselves. Wages impact our ability to house ourselves. Our ability to have childcare so that we can work longer hours, so we can work certain types of jobs, impacts our ability to house ourselves. And so when you have 83,000 people apply for 2,000 grants, right? When you have 513,000 people file unemployment claims, when you're unable to pay rent, who want to pay rent, who typically pay their rent, but now we're in a situation where they can't, we have a huge problem. And I think coming up with sort of stopgap measures is what we're programmed to do. But we really have to look beyond this moment. We have to look at what were the canaries in the mine that told us we were careening towards a problem in the first place. And one last thing before I stop, we've already heard the amount of people who are paying more than what they can afford in rent. You look statewide, again, there's counties where 1 out of 3 renters are paying more than 50% of their income just on rent. How can you function if half your income is gone the first of every single month? And so we have to begin to really think about how our economy, how our housing market, how our health system, how all of our systems disproportionately marginalize and neglect the most vulnerable people in our society.
Thanks, Jawanza. And I want to keep us moving since I know we don't have a whole bunch of time and a lot of ground to cover. But with all those points in mind, I want us to start thinking also about federal support, what's been given, what might come in future stimulus, but really centering around this question of what can we learn from the last time we were in a somewhat similar situation, right? 10-ish years ago with the foreclosure crisis and the Great Recession, what did we learn from then that is applicable for today? And for this question, I'm hoping maybe we can start with Stacey and Mark, if that sounds good.
Great, thanks. So I do think that I said it in my remarks, rental assistance, and just to, build off of what Jawanza just said, we have needed more rental assistance for a good long time. I mean, this is not new to the crisis. We are in an emergency situation now. But right now, the way we dole out subsidy to people is, by the lottery. We have a lottery system. And so it seems to me like we've needed more rental assistance for a good long time. And right now, we are in crisis. And if people can't pay the rent, then the buildings can't function properly. And what we learned in the last crisis was how very quickly and fragile this system is, and how quickly, when the buildings aren't kept up, and when the owners aren't able to pay what they need to pay and maintain what they need to maintain, how quickly everything deteriorates. And that goes for owner occupants as well as rental owners. And so I think we need to figure out, we don't just need a little bit of rental assistance, we need a lot of rental assistance. And we need to make sure that the folks who need emergency assistance, and then they're going to be able to, transition to something more permanent, that they get that assistance that they need. We need to figure out, we have tried to figure out these systems for a long time. And now is our moment. We need the rental assistance to help people pay the rent and make sure that both the renters themselves and the buildings are sustained over time.
Yeah, and I can just add to some of that. I remember back during the last foreclosure housing crisis, For renters, the federal government passed what was known as the Protecting Tenants at Foreclosure Act, which seemed to have much broader protections. I think it was looking at protecting renters who were in federally related mortgages, which we all interpreted to mean almost everything, given that people that own homes and have mortgages have benefited from our economic system, and now they had to the Congress felt that under the Commerce Clause they were able to limit the ability of these companies, investors, whoever were taking properties at foreclosure sales from vacating the properties. And that happened at the federal level. And I hope that the CARES Act, which right now is for, it's probably impacting maybe about half of the rental properties in America. Hopefully that will be expanded to protect more properties. Right now it creates a moratorium on evictions for 120 days. But folks don't even know whether or not they're protected, because it's inexplicable to a tenant whether or not their landlord's property is covered under CARES. So we have to do something about changing how evictions are filed and what is disclosed at the eviction filing to ensure the tenants who are protected under the CARES Act are receiving those protections. So that was at the federal level. More could have been done at that time, and I think that at this stage, now that we already know that renters are impacted to the same degree as homeowners, and that renters and property managers are all in this ecosystem together. I'm hoping that there'll be forbearance and relief across the board. At the city level, back during the last mortgage foreclosure crisis, the city passed what was known as the Keep Chicago Renting Ordinance, which stopped investors who took properties at foreclosure in Chicago from vacating the properties again, because it was happening at the local level. And if you look at what's happening now, and it's so much broader, the base of people that can't pay their rent, we need to have something similar to that. And we already have that in thinking about just cause protections, where renters can't be evicted for no good reason. And then if we had something like just cause protections already in place, we could tweak it during an emergency so that something like COVID-19 would be not just cause for evicting, and then figure out a way that we can back end whatever this non-payment of rent would be. So again, tenants could receive some kind of rent relief. In terms of how the court system has reacted to the prior foreclosure crisis, and how they could react again now. During the prior foreclosure crisis, it was understood that homeowners were impacted, but not so much renters. And in the foreclosure court, the courts created all of these mandatory arbitration requirements to ensure that people actually had to talk to each other and work things out before we went to the ultimate resolution, which would be an eviction, a foreclosure order. Well, today we can do the same thing with eviction courts, where we can ensure that that people are getting an opportunity to be screened for homeless prevention dollars. And again, there are many opportunities for those dollars to be expanded through the CARES Act and through other means, so that people who have short-term crises can remain in the home. We can figure out how to, maybe the rent relief will be able to pay all or some of that back. And people that have long-term crises can actually be looked at as housing unstable, and where can we find some other kind of relief for them so that they can remain housed, either, as Jawanza mentioned, through empty public housing units, or coming up with ways to expand the rental subsidy program, which is really a bargain when you look at the cost of homelessness for the different jurisdictions.
Thank you, Mark. And before we transition to some of the Q&A that we've been getting, I think maybe it makes sense to just do a little round robin with everyone. Obviously, there's so many topics that we're only scratching the surface of. I'm curious, is there anything that you think we should be talking about that has not been addressed so far? Or what are some of the other things you want to make sure people walk away with from this discussion? And maybe we can go start with Daniel, Stacey, Jawanza, Mark, in that order.
Sure. So, you know, I in terms of things that haven't been talked about, I mean, there's simultaneously so much, and I feel like people are doing a good job of talking about the most important issues here. You know, I guess I would, you know, I would really emphasize to folks, well, a couple of things. One, I think, you know, DOH is trying to take really seriously, as I think a number of people have mentioned, its role in just sort of disseminating information and letting people know, you know, what their rights are and what resources exist. And so if, you know, I know we have a lot of people here who are plugged into a lot of different networks. If in the chat, you know, there are particular things that you would like to see from the department in terms of playing that role, I would be very interested in that feedback. You know, the other thing I would just highlight, and I think a lot of our work is looking at this now, is just really the importance of what's going to be in the next federal stimulus bill. The level of resources that are needed to address this crisis, a lot of those need to come from the federal government, so we can use those emergency solutions grants, you know, mortgage and eviction, you know, forbearance and assistance. And so I would just encourage people to stay on that. The round 4, there's a lot of organizing already going around the country on that. And that's going to play a huge role in how states and local governments are able to respond in the months going forward.
So I would just, I guess maybe, again, build on some of the points that we are just talking about. So, you know, there has been so much obvious discussion that we should be having around eviction, right? Because if a tenant can't afford to pay the rent, then they get evicted. And this is the worst case scenario for everyone. But I do want to take a minute to talk about responsible tenants and responsible landlords, because as Mark said, and I think Jawanza said, responsible renters are going to pay rent if they can. That's what they do. If they can pay rent, they will. And in the same way, responsible landlords see eviction as an absolute last resort. It's expensive for them. And so we talk a lot about eviction as if eviction is a foregone conclusion. And I feel like we can shift this a little bit to talk about the need for people to have the money to pay rent, the rental assistance, so that they can pay rent, again, so that the buildings can be healthy, the renters can be financially stable. You know, again, eviction, it feels like we're sort of headed to kind of the worst common denominator, and we need to know that. And absolutely, I'm glad the eviction protections are in place, because for the irresponsible landlords who do run to that as an option, the tenants need to be protected from that right now. But I do feel like there is this, you know, responsible majority on both sides. And if there were rental assistance to help the tenants pay rent, and again, the landlords, the last thing they want to do is evict a responsible tenant. A good tenant is like gold for a landlord. And so, you know, I feel like we talk a lot about evictions, and again, we should, but we also need to talk about sort of, you know, the other side of this, which is making sure that the tenants can pay rent.
I think Stacey, sort of her last comments raises a really good point. We have a system that frankly just isn't working. And I think we have to use this moment to help us realize how vulnerable all of us are in order to figure out what the solutions need to be going forward, right? If $1,200 is the check that we're expecting to come from the federal government per person, minus taxes. If the average rent in Chicago is $1,800, you're going to pay part of your rent, right? But then again, where's the money for everything else? And what do we know in terms of what's going to happen for May rent, for June rent? And so for us, we have to cancel rent, cancel mortgage for the duration of the stay-at-home order and the 3 months following. We have to. We've already said, I think all of us are in full agreement. The largest line item in every household budget well, nearly every household budget is housing costs. When you look statewide, it's not just renters who are cost burdened, but people who have a mortgage that they also can't afford, right? And so we have to figure out how to improve this system. There also has to be a moratorium on eviction filings. Of course, there are, conscientious landlords out there who don't want to file evictions, but we can't deny the fact that there are corporate landlords, venture capital firms who have gotten into the rental market after the foreclosure crisis because the rental market was flooded with former homeowners who don't care. They just don't. And I defy you to show me one who does. When you look at the impact that they have on these communities, predominantly low income or working communities, I don't see where they have the community's best interest at heart. And so if we know, again, that's the reality of the situation, how do we fix it? And I think it involves all of us coming together, throwing out convention, and figuring out something different that's going to work for the majority of people.
Yeah, and I just echo some of the things that were said. I think we need to have something different come out of this. When we get the economy started again, we need to have, jobs that pay a living wage where people can afford to live in the city. In terms of what's been missing in this conversation, I think Jawanza mentioned a portion of it, which is he's calling for no eviction filings. I want people to understand, and I know many of you do, that right now the ad hoc administrative orders and court orders that people are calling an eviction moratorium are not that. All they are right now is keeping people from social distancing, which is a good thing, and stopping the court from actually entering eviction orders and the sheriff from executing the orders. But there's no period of time where people are going to have some certainty where they're going to be able to get back in good terms with the landlord and figure out a way to work this out with them. These orders could disappear if the executive or the courts decide that they don't want to renew them. And so, nationally, a lot of people are looking at how do we have an eviction moratorium that's a true one that starts from the notices that are being provided so that people can't go and give notices, which is against the social distancing principles, all the way through to having an eviction executed on, so that we can figure out how to get people back on their feet before going forward. And to that end, I think that people really need to get legal counsel to the best of their ability when they're talking to landlords. I agree 100% with Stacey. People need to be talking to each other and trying to work this out. But tenants need to understand that if these notices come, and right now, the landlord's allowed to give the notices, and the notices expire, 5-day notice expires in 5 days, and if tenant hasn't paid the rent, then when the eviction courts start over again, everything is already in place and there's not much that a tenant can do. So the negotiation that needs to happen and the talking that needs to be with either legal counsel or lots of legal information. And I'll give a plug for our website. We're utilizing this really great chatbot called rentervention.com that hopefully will be able to triage renters to virtual attorneys to help them and also provide legal information. But right now, if people get the notices until we're able to do something to change the rules in eviction courts, those notices are foregone conclusions once eviction court starts up again. So be careful and make sure that whatever agreements you get, you put in writing.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks all. Miriam, I think we have about a little under 10 minutes to get a few of the Q&A, so I'll let you filter those.
Yeah, thank you, Juan Sebastian. So obviously we won't have time to get to them all, but some of the questions that are coming up are probably Stacey, these are questions that you can start us off with. Is what's coming out in terms of supports for small mom and pop landlords? Yeah, let's just start there.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And again, I think there's a lot of confusion out there. There's this brand new program that the Small Business Association came out with called the Payment Protection Program. And so, it's not for every single landlord, but I do think the vast majority could potentially benefit. And just to be clear, in the past, small landlords didn't really take advantage of, nor were they sort of targeted with SBA programs. And so this is all brand new. This is all brand new. And I'm afraid that a lot of owners don't think that they qualify, and they do. And again, this is all new for us too. So we're learning along with all of you. But again, the SBA Payment Protection Program, this is, a really great way to tell the federal government you work through your local bank to apply if you already have worked with the SBA, but whoever your lender is, ask them if they do it. Even if you're a small teeny weeny, even if you're an owner occupant of a 2-flat, you can't apply for that program. You can't apply for payment protection, but there's another SBA program, and it's called the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. I don't know, maybe it's not called that. It's EIDL, and you can apply for that. And again, if you're having a COVID-related loss, if your tenant isn't paying because of a COVID-related issue, you can apply for that. And so I do think that there's resources. They're not all perfect. They're not all, going to help every single person, but they're out there. And again, the Preservation Compact website has a list of resources, including these SBA resources. Just like with unemployment, just apply. I mean, that's what I keep telling everybody is apply. You'd rather give it a try and then be turned down than to have missed out on something.
Thank you, Stacey. And just to reiterate, we are going to be posting the recording of this webinar on the MPC website, and we'd be also happy to share resources from all of our panelists on there as well. So we've heard all of you express interest in the importance of rental assistance, and we know about the city's program. So there's a lot of questions that are coming up about this. Was this included in the CARES Act, or is this more advocacy work that needs to be happening for future stimulus and recovery bills from the federal government? And then, if we get this money, what would a rollout look like? Who would structure, monitor, implement this kind of mass rental assistance that we know is important? I'll let any of you respond to that.
I think the thinking is that under the CARES Act, ESG and CDBG funds can be used for rental assistance. I'm sure Daniel knows an awful lot more about that. One thing I will say, though, is as much as portable housing choice vouchers are really a great solution, we have to, if we put this across the board for people, and again, only 25% of people that qualify have these because they're not available, and that's why people are always at risk. They're living paycheck to paycheck because they should have access to this assistance, and they don't. But it can pervert the rental market if we're not really careful about how we throw the money everywhere. It's not about jacking up the cost for everybody because there's now housing choice voucher money out there. So we need to be careful about how we spread it. But if we do it really intelligently for people that qualify, it's the housing first model, and it's much more efficient. There's a cost benefit there to keep people housed rather than have people go through this eviction cycle where they're constantly moving from place to place and moving out of places into worse places for more money, which is what we see happening to people that face eviction court.
I would just second that and say, however this happens, vouchers do not have to be the platform. I totally agree with what you just said, Mark, that we need something that's flexible. The Low Income Housing Trust Fund, the Chicago Low Income Housing Trust Fund is such a wonderful model. And it used to be that they actually had just little discrete chunks of money. And so as opposed to kind of these complicated calculations based on people's income, they said, okay, if you're under a certain income, you get, $300 or $400. And so I don't know if that's the way or not, but I do think that something that's flexible, something that is able to address the issues of people who are in an emergency crisis, as Mark was just describing, it doesn't have to be, I don't think it has to be the exact voucher platform. And I do think this is an opportunity to figure out a structure and a system that we can use for the long haul too, and recognize that there are there are a lot of folks who are vulnerable and have been vulnerable since before the crisis. And perhaps this is our opportunity to set up a system that works, again, beyond this.
I would agree with all of that, and I would say, you know, another avenue that we're looking at is, you know, through actual affordable property managers and developers, because just because you're in a affordable housing already doesn't mean there isn't also a problem. Most people in affordable housing also have rent payments that they make, and a lot of them are in the kind of lower wage service sector industries that have been shutting down, and where wages have been cut or jobs have been cut. And so, you know, what the department is also looking at it, is there ways for us to route what is, you know, effectively will eventually make, you know, become support for renters through the affordable developers and property managers as well.
I'd like to just add one more thing to this also. You know, one thing that we have advocated innumerable times to the Chicago Housing Authority is to better utilize or maximize its utilization of the real estate acquisition program, where instead of focusing the energy on new construction, which by and large isn't happening, purchase and rehab existing property that's vacant and abandoned. Every model we run shows that it's ridiculously much more cost effective. Is also much more time effective. You really can get people into these existing properties for much fewer dollars in a relatively short amount of time. And again, and thinking about how all of us can work together to fix this problem, the Chicago Housing Authority has to be squarely brought into this conversation.
Thank you, Jawanza. So the last but not least at all, and probably won't, it'll longer discussion than 2 minutes that we have, what's the role of banks and lenders in the solutions here?
So I would just quickly say, you know, we've read a lot about forbearance, and I won't get into the details, but certainly the federal government has given strong signals to lenders, both private lenders as well as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and FHA, that lenders who agree to non-eviction in some cases can get forbearance, which means they don't have to pay the owners don't have to pay their mortgage for some period of time, 90 days, but they do have to pay it back. So I would just note that that's helpful. It's not great, it's not perfect, but I would also say that there are stronger things that the banks could be doing, but they probably won't until we understand kind of the length and breadth of this crisis. So they could be looking at loan modifications in the future, for instance. They could be looking at forbearance where the missed payments, you know, they can spread out how long it would take to pay back those missed payments. There are certainly other things that lenders can do, but I also think that they're taking a little bit of a wait and see attitude, both on the federal regulators as well as the banks, because if this is a shorter crisis, perhaps this forbearance would be enough, and they'll probably take a wait and see kind of attitude.
Thank you, Stacey. Well, it looks like we are just out of time. I want to thank our panelists again so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge with us. As I mentioned, we're going to be posting the recording of this. Feel free to email us any other resources or questions. Obviously, we're happy to pass them along to the panelists. And thank you to all of our participants for joining us today. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.